Thunder crashed in the distance as Faith Hawkins desperately clung to her stallion's mane. The fierce Wyoming wind of 1878 whipping her chestnut hair across her face like angry serpents. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon all afternoon had finally unleashed its fury, turning what should have been a simple journey home into a desperate fight for survival. Faith had known better than to travel alone. Her father, a respected rancher in Sweetwater County, had warned her countless times about the dangers that lurked in these untamed lands. But the stubborn streak that had earned her the nickname Wildfire among the townsfolk had gotten the better of her once again. Now she was paying the price. "Come on, Thunder," she shouted above the howling wind, urging her beloved black stallion forward through the relentless downpour. The normally reliable horse whinnied in protest, his hooves slipping on the increasingly muddy ground. In the 3 years since moving west from Boston after her mother's death, Faith had learned to respect the land's temperament. The open prairie could be breathtakingly beautiful one moment and deadly the next. Today, it had chosen the latter. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the rugged landscape around her. Faith caught sight of a steep ravine to her right, a landmark she recognized. Relief flooded through her. If she could just make it past the ravine, her father's ranch would be less than an hour's ride away. But nature had other plans. Another flash of lightning, this one striking close enough to send Thunder into a panic. The stallion reared violently, his muscular body twisting as he neighed in terror. Faith, caught off guard, felt herself slipping from the saddle. "No!" she cried, fingers desperately grabbing for the reins, but it was too late. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her shoulder as Thunder bolted into the storm, taking with him her supplies, her rifle, and her only means of getting home. "Thunder!" Faith called out, struggling to her feet, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. Rain pelted her face as she stared in the direction her horse had disappeared. "Come back!" only the wind answered. Faith stood alone, drenched and shivering as the enormity of her situation dawned on her. Lost in a fierce storm, miles from home, with night falling and no supplies. At 22, she had survived plenty of hardships, but this might be the one that broke her. "Keep moving," she muttered to herself, wrapping her soaked jacket tighter around her body. "Find shelter." The light was fading fast as Faith trudged forward, each step more difficult than the last as her boots sank into the mud. The rain had not let up, and now the temperature was dropping. She had heard enough stories about travelers freezing to death in spring storms to know her situation was dire. After what seemed like hours of walking, Faith's legs trembled with exhaustion. The darkness was nearly complete now, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. During one such flash, she spotted what appeared to be a rocky outcropping ahead, not ideal shelter, but better than nothing. She had just changed course toward the rocks when the ground beneath her right foot suddenly gave way. A sickening sensation of falling, then pain sharp and immediate as her ankle twisted unnaturally. Faith cried out, collapsing into the mud. When she tried to stand, her ankle buckled beneath her weight. "No, no, no," she whispered, fighting back tears of pain and frustration. She crawled forward, mud caking her hands and clothes, until she reached the small rocky overhang she'd spotted. It barely qualified as shelter, just enough rock to block some of the rain, but nothing more. Faith curled into herself, shivering violently as the cold seeped into her bones. Her thoughts drifted to her father, who would surely be frantic with worry by now. Would anyone be able to search for her in this storm? Or would they find her days later, another tragic tale of the untamed West's cruelty? As consciousness began to slip away, Faith thought she heard something beyond the storm's fury, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats. Hallucinations, she decided, brought on by cold and exhaustion. No sane person would be riding in this weather, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. Then came a voice, deep and steady, cutting through the storm's roar. "Hello? Anybody out there?" Faith tried to call out, but her voice emerged as little more than a croak. She fumbled at her waist for the small silver whistle her father had insisted she carry. Her frozen fingers finally closed around it, and she brought it to her lips, blowing with all the strength she could muster. The shrill sound pierced the night. The hoofbeats paused, then changed direction, coming closer. "Hello," the voice called again, nearer now. Faith blew the whistle once more, then collapsed back against the rocks, her energy spent. A few moments later, a tall figure on horseback materialized from the darkness, illuminated briefly by lightning. The rider dismounted swiftly, approaching with a lantern held high. "My God," the man's voice came, softer now. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Faith looked up into concerned eyes beneath the brim of a rain-soaked hat. The man kneeling before her was perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and shoulders broad enough to block much of the wind that had been tormenting her. "Storm took my horse," she managed, teeth chattering. "And my way." The stranger nodded grimly, shrugging off his heavy duster and wrapping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, was immediate and overwhelming. "You're found now," he said firmly, his eyes meeting hers with a certainty that, despite everything, made Faith believe him. "I'm Colton O'Malley, and I'm going to get you somewhere safe." Faith didn't protest when Colton lifted her onto his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding that stood patient in the rain. Nor did she object when he climbed up behind her, one strong arm holding her securely against his chest as he turned the horse toward what she hoped was shelter. "My ankle," she murmured, feeling obligated to warn him of her injury. "We'll tend to it soon," he promised, his breath warm against her ear. "Just stay with me." Faith nodded weakly, allowing herself to lean back against the solid warmth of him. As consciousness faded, her last coherent thought was wondering if she'd just been rescued, or if this was merely a pleasant dream before the cold claimed her completely. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the steady beating of Colton's heart against her back lulled Faith into a state between wakefulness and sleep. The rain continued to fall, but the worst of the storm seemed to have passed, the thunder now a distant rumble rather than the bone-shaking crashes of before. "Almost there," Colton's deep voice broke through her haze. "Just a little farther." Faith forced her eyes open. Through the drizzle, she could make out a faint glow of light ahead, a lantern in a window, perhaps. As they drew closer, the shape of a small cabin emerged from the darkness. It wasn't much to look at, a simple one-room structure with a wooden porch and chimney, but to Faith, it looked like paradise. "You're home?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Line's shack," Colton corrected. "I work for the Circle B Ranch. We keep these cabins stocked for when we're working cattle far from the main house." He guided his horse to a small lean-to beside the cabin that served as a makeshift stable. Once there, he dismounted gracefully before reaching up to help Faith down. Her legs buckled instantly when her injured ankle touched the ground. "Easy now," Colton said, catching her before she fell. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms. "I can walk," Faith protested weakly, even as she instinctively curled toward his warmth. "Maybe tomorrow," he replied with a hint of amusement. "Tonight you're going to rest." He carried her to the cabin's door, somehow managing to open it without putting her down. Inside, the space was sparse but tidy, a small iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed along the wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with supplies. Most importantly, it was dry. Colton gently set Faith on one of the chairs. "Stay put," he instructed, though it wasn't as if she could go anywhere. "I need to tend to my horse, then I'll be back to look after you." Faith nodded, too exhausted to argue. When the door closed behind him, she took stock of her situation. Every part of her body ached. Her clothes were soaked through, mud caked and clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Her auburn hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her ankle throbbed relentlessly. Yet somehow she had survived. Colton returned quickly, bringing with him his saddlebags and the lingering scent of rain. He moved with purpose, first lighting more lanterns to brighten the cabin, then kneeling to start a fire in the stove. "Thank you," Faith said, watching him work. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "Let's not think about that," he replied, glancing up at her as flames began to catch on the kindling. "What's your name?" "Faith Hawkins." "Hawkins," Colton's brow furrowed. "Any relation to Jeremiah Hawkins of the Double H?" "He's my father," Faith confirmed. Understanding dawned on Colton's face. "You're Jeremiah's daughter from back east. I've heard about you." He stood, dusting his hands on his pants. "Your father's a good man. I've done business with him a few times." "He'll be worried sick about me," Faith said, guilt twisting in her stomach. "No doubt, but there's nothing to be done about it tonight." Colton moved to a trunk in the corner, from which he pulled several woolen blankets and a set of clothes. "These will be too big for you, but they're dry. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." He laid the items on the bed, then turned back to her. "Can you manage on your own?" Faith hesitated. Under normal circumstances, the mere suggestion of undressing with a strange man in the room would have been scandalous. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and her injured ankle complicated matters. "I think I'll need help," she admitted reluctantly. "My ankle?" Colton nodded, his expression remaining professionally neutral. "I'll help you to the bed, then turn my back while you change. Call me when you're ready, and I'll take a look at that ankle." True to his word, Colton helped Faith to the bed, then turned to face the wall while she struggled out of her sodden garments. The woolen shirt he'd provided nearly swallowed her whole, and the pants were impossibly large, but they were blissfully dry. "I'm decent," she called once she'd managed to wrap one of the blankets around her waist like a skirt. Colton turned, carrying a basin of water and a small box that appeared to be a medical kit. He knelt by the bed, gently lifting her injured ankle to examine it. "It's not broken," he said after careful probing that made Faith wince despite his gentleness. "A bad sprain, though. You're lucky." "Lucky isn't exactly how I'd describe my evening," Faith replied with a wry smile. A corner of Colton's mouth lifted in response. "Fair enough." He began to wrap her ankle with practiced efficiency. "How did you end up out there, anyway? That's no place for anyone to be alone during a storm." Faith sighed. "I was visiting a neighbor, Mrs. Billings. Her husband died last winter and she's been struggling with the ranch. I bring her supplies sometimes, help with chores." She tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "I stayed longer than I meant to. The storm looked far off when I started for home, but it moved in quickly." "They do that out here," Colton said, securing the bandage. "It's one of the first things you learn living on the frontier: respect the weather." "I've lived here 3 years," Faith said defensively. "I know about the weather, I just misjudged. It happens to the best of us," Colton conceded. He rose and moved to the stove, returning with a steaming mug. "Drink this. It'll warm you up." Faith accepted the mug gratefully. The hot coffee burned down her throat, spreading warmth through her chest. For the first time since the storm began, she felt her muscles begin to relax. "So what were you doing out in that storm?" she asked. "Surely you weren't just riding around hoping to rescue damsels in distress." Colton chuckled, the sound low and pleasant. No, though it seems to have worked out that way. He pulled the second chair over and sat facing her. I was checking on some cattle in the north pasture. Got caught in the storm same as you. Figured I'd hole up here for the night. In the lantern light, Faith could see him clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a rugged way, with features weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a deep blue that reminded her of summer skies, and his dark hair curled slightly where it had begun to dry. A small scar crossed his left eyebrow, giving his face character rather than marring it. "Lucky for me," she said softly. "Lucky for both of us," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. "It's a comfort not to be alone on a night like this." Something in his tone made Faith's heart beat a little faster. She looked down at her coffee, suddenly self-conscious. "You should rest," Colton said, rising from his chair. "Take the bed, I'll make do on the floor." "I couldn't put you out of your bed," Faith protested. "You're injured and you've been through an ordeal," he countered firmly. "I insist." Too exhausted to argue further, Faith nodded. As Colton busied himself making a pallet on the floor with spare blankets, she settled back against the pillow. The events of the day caught up with her all at once, and she felt her eyelids growing heavy. "Mr. O'Malley," she murmured, fighting to stay awake just a moment longer. "Colton," he corrected. "Or Colt, if you prefer." "Colton," Faith repeated. "Thank you for everything." His expression softened. "Get some rest, Faith. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you home." As she drifted into sleep, Faith's last thought was that despite the terror of the storm, the loss of her horse, and her injured ankle, there was something about being in this small cabin with Colton O'Malley that felt strangely like finding something she hadn't known she was missing. Dawn broke clear and golden, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Faith woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up carefully, wincing as pain shot through her ankle. Colton was already awake, stoking the fire in the stove. He turned at the sound of her movement. "Morning," he said. "How's the ankle?" Faith grimaced. "Still attached, which I suppose is something to be grateful for." That earned her a smile. "Hungry. I've got beans warming and coffee brewing." "Starving," she admitted. Now that he mentioned it, she realized she hadn't eaten since midday yesterday. Colton helped her to the table, his strong hands steady and sure as she hobbled across the cabin. Once she was seated, he served up a simple but hearty breakfast of beans, jerky, and hardtack softened in coffee. "It's not exactly what you might be used to," he apologized, taking the seat across from her. "It's perfect," Faith assured him, digging in with unexpected enthusiasm. "And I'm not as delicate as I might look. I can ride, shoot, and even brand a calf when needed." "So I've heard," Colton said, watching her with what might have been admiration. "Your father speaks highly of your capabilities, says you've taken to ranch life better than anyone expected." "Did you know my father well before I arrived?" Faith asked between bites. Colton shook his head. "Not well. Our paths crossed at cattle auctions, town meetings. The usual. Circle B and Double H don't share borders, so we don't have much cause for interaction." "And yet you recognized my name immediately." A faint flush colored Colton's cheeks. "Your arrival was something of an event in these parts. Not many refined Eastern ladies choose to make their homes in Wyoming territory." "I'm hardly refined," Faith protested with a laugh. "My mother despaired of ever making a proper lady of me." "Is that why you came west? To escape propriety?" Faith's smile faded. "No, my mother died 3 years ago, consumption. My father had already established the ranch by then, but had been living apart from us while I finished my schooling in Boston. After her death, there was nothing keeping me there." She looked down at her plate. "And I wanted to know my father better. We'd been separated too long." "I'm sorry about your mother," Colton said softly. "Thank you." Faith took a breath, pushing the melancholy aside. "What about your family? Are you from Wyoming originally?" Colton shook his head. "Texas. Came north with a cattle drive when I was 17 and never went back. Been working for the Circle B ever since." "No family waiting for you in Texas. None that would notice if I never returned," he said with a shrug that suggested there was more to that story. "Wyoming's my home now." They fell into easy conversation as they finished their meal. Faith was surprised by how comfortable she felt with this man she'd only just met. There was something steady about Colton O'Malley, a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. After breakfast, Colton helped Faith back to the bed so she could rest while he went outside to check on his horse and survey the damage from the storm. "I'm going to see if I can spot your stallion while I'm out there," he told her. "What did you call him? Thunder?" "Yes," Faith said gratefully. "He's black with a white blaze. My father gave him to me when I arrived. He means a great deal to me." "I'll keep an eye out," Colton promised. Left alone, Faith found herself studying the cabin more closely. It was Spartan but functional, like the man who currently occupied it. A few personal touches caught her eye: a small carved wooden horse on the shelf, a well-worn copy of the Iliad beside the bed, a harmonica resting on the window sill. She was reaching for the book when the cabin door opened, and Colton returned, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning air. "Trail's a mess of mud," he reported, removing his hat. "But the creek's risen so high it's nearly a river now. We won't be getting you back to Double H today, I'm afraid." Faith tried to hide her disappointment. "My father will be beside himself with worry." "If the water goes down by midday, I'll ride to your ranch and let him know you're safe," Colton offered. "It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing." "That's very kind," Faith said. "Though I hate to think of imposing on your hospitality any longer." Colton's expression softened. "It's no imposition. Truth be told, I was due for a few days at this line shack anyway, taking inventory, making repairs. You're just giving me company while I work." "Then at least let me help," Faith insisted. "I can't walk well, but I can still use my hands." "We'll see," was all Colton would commit to, but there was a gleam of respect in his eyes that Faith found herself wanting to nurture. By midday, the creek had receded enough that Colton deemed it safe to make the journey to the Double H. He prepared to leave, saddling his horse and gathering supplies. "I should be back before sundown," he told Faith, who sat on the porch, her injured ankle propped on a stool. "There's food inside and the rifle's loaded if you need it, though I doubt you will." "I'll be fine," Faith assured him. "Please give my father my love and tell him not to worry. I'm in good hands." Something flickered in Colton's eyes at her words. "I'll tell him," he said, swinging up into the saddle. "Rest that ankle while I'm gone." Faith watched him ride away, a tall, straight figure against the vast Wyoming sky. Only when he disappeared from view did she acknowledge the strange, hollow feeling his absence created. She had known this man less than a day. It made no sense to miss him already. Yet somehow she did. True to his word, Colton returned as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. But he wasn't alone. Trotting behind his gelding, tethered by a lead rope, was a familiar black stallion. "Thunder!" Faith exclaimed, struggling to her feet as Colton rode into the yard. The cowboy dismounted, a grin spreading across his normally serious face. "Found him about 5 miles east, grazing as calm as you please. Your saddlebags are still intact, though your rifle took a beating in the fall." Faith hobbled down the porch steps, ignoring the pain in her ankle as she rushed to her horse. Thunder nickered softly, pushing his velvety nose against her chest in greeting. "Oh, you troublesome beast," she scolded fondly, stroking his neck. "You gave me such a fright." He seems no worse for wear, Colton observed, untying the lead rope. Tough animal. Like his mistress, Faith said with a smile. She turned to Colton, impulsively reaching for his hand. Thank you. This means more than I can say. Colton's hand was warm and calloused against her own. Your father says to tell you he's relieved beyond measure to know you're safe. He wanted to ride back with me, but there's trouble with rustlers on his south range. He'll come for you as soon as it's resolved. Faith nodded, releasing his hand reluctantly. Did you tell him about my ankle? I did. He agreed you're better off resting it here than trying to ride home too soon. Colton took the reins of both horses. Let me get these two settled, and then I'll help you back inside. You shouldn't be putting weight on that ankle yet. Before Faith could protest, he had swept her into his arms again, carrying her effortlessly back to the porch and depositing her gently on the bench there. You know, she said, slightly breathless, a gentleman would ask before picking a lady up like that. A slow smile spread across Colton's face. If you wanted a gentleman, Miss Hawkins, you should have gotten yourself rescued by someone else. The teasing light in his eyes made Faith laugh. Then I suppose I'll have to endure your frontier manners, Mr. O'Malley. I suppose you will, he agreed, tipping his hat before leading the horses to the lean-to. That evening they shared another simple meal, though this one was supplemented by items from Faith's recovered saddlebags: dried apples, a jar of honey, and a small packet of tea leaves that Colton declared a luxury indeed. As they sat by the warmth of the stove, nursing cups of the precious tea, Faith found herself studying Colton's profile in the golden lamplight. There was a quietness about him that she found increasingly compelling, not the awkward silence of a man unused to company, but the comfortable stillness of someone at peace with himself. Tell me about the Circle B, she said, breaking the comfortable silence. How long have you worked there? Going on 10 years now, Colton replied. Started as a ranch hand, worked my way up to foreman about 3 years back. Do you enjoy it, being responsible for so much? Colton considered the question. Most days, it's honest work. The men respect me and I respect them. The Burkes, they own the ranch, they're good people. Fair. But, Faith prompted, sensing there was more. Colton glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes at her perception. But sometimes I think about having something of my own. A smaller spread, maybe. Something I could build with my own 2 hands. What's stopping you? Money, mostly, he admitted. Land isn't cheap, and starting a ranch from scratch takes capital I don't have yet. I'm saving, though. He took a sip of his tea. What about you? Is running the Double H with your father what you want? Faith leaned back in her chair, considering. I love the ranch, and I love working alongside my father. But sometimes I wonder if he sees me as a true partner or just a temporary helper until I fulfill my womanly destiny and marry some suitable rancher. And is that what you want? To marry a suitable rancher? There was something in his tone that made Faith look up sharply. Was that tension she detected? Interest? I want a partnership, she said carefully. Whether in ranching or marriage, I didn't come west to be ornamental or to sit idly while men make all the decisions. She smiled wryly. That makes me quite unmarriageable by most standards out here. Not all standards, Colton said quietly, his gaze steady on hers. The air between them seemed to thicken. Faith felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down at her teacup to break the sudden intensity of the moment. My father worries I'll never find someone who understands me, she said, striving for lightness. Fathers worry, Colton replied. It's their nature. He stood, gathering their empty cups. We should turn in. Tomorrow I need to fix that loose board on the porch, and you need to rest that ankle if you want it to heal properly. The shift back to practical matters eased the tension, though Faith found herself oddly disappointed. As on the previous night, Colton insisted she take the bed while he made do with blankets on the floor. "Good night, Colton," Faith said softly as he extinguished the lamp. "Good night, Faith," he replied, his deep voice comforting in the darkness. "Sleep well." But sleep eluded her for some time as Faith lay awake, listening to Colton's steady breathing just a few feet away, wondering what it might be like to build something with a man like him, something that was truly a partnership of equals. The next 3 days fell into an unexpectedly pleasant rhythm. Colton worked around the cabin, making repairs and tending to the horses, while Faith rested her ankle as instructed. But being naturally active, she soon grew restless and insisted on helping however she could. Colton gave her small tasks, mending a shirt with the sewing kit from her saddlebags, sorting the meager supplies in the cabin, even teaching her to play a simple tune on his harmonica, which made them both laugh at her initial clumsy attempts. In the evenings, they talked. Faith learned that Colton had left Texas after a falling out with his father, a hard-drinking man who believed raising cattle was the only honorable profession, and that books were for soft-handed city folk. Despite this, Colton had developed a love of reading during the quiet hours of night watch on cattle drives, devouring any book he could get his hands on. In turn, Faith told him about her childhood in Boston, her mother's gentle insistence on proper manners and her own stubborn resistance to being molded into a society lady. She spoke of her initial fear upon arriving in Wyoming, fear she'd never admit to her father, and how that fear had gradually transformed into a deep love for the wild, open land. "I never thought I'd feel at home here," she confessed on the third night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Her ankle, while still tender, had improved enough that she could move around the cabin with just a slight limp. "Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. The West has a way of getting into your blood," Colton agreed. He was whittling a small piece of wood, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small knife. "Makes everywhere else seem too confined." "Exactly," Faith said, pleased that he understood. "My aunt wrote last month suggesting I return to Boston now that I'm of a marriageable age. She said I could still make a suitable match despite my rustic interlude." Colton's hands paused in their work. "And will you return east?" Faith shook her head firmly. "Never. My life is here now." She hesitated, then added more softly, "Though I do sometimes miss certain things. Dancing, music, books that haven't been read so many times the pages are falling out." "There's a dance in Sweetwater next month," Colton said casually, resuming his whittling. "Harvest celebration. Not as fancy as your Boston affairs, I'd wager, but there's music and dancing." "Are you asking me to go with you, Mr. O'Malley?" Faith teased, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. Colton looked up, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I believe I am, Miss Hawkins." "That is if you'd consider being seen with a mere ranch foreman." "I'd be honored," Faith said, matching his seriousness. "Though I warn you, I may have forgotten how to dance properly. It's been some time." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I reckon we can figure it out together." The simple statement carried a weight that seemed to extend beyond dancing. Faith found herself wondering if he felt it too, this growing connection between them, built on quiet conversations and shared confidences. Before she could pursue that thought, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful evening. Colton was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip as he stepped protectively in front of Faith. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and authoritative. But as the riders came into view, Faith recognized the lead figure immediately. "It's my father," she exclaimed, rising awkwardly to her feet. Sure enough, Jeremiah Hawkins and two of his ranch hands rode into the yard, their expressions relieved when they spotted Faith on the porch. "Faith," her father called, dismounting with the agility of a much younger man. Though in his 50s, Jeremiah Hawkins was still straight-backed and strong, his once dark hair now liberally streaked with gray. "Thank God you're all right." Faith hobbled down the steps, embracing her father tightly. "I'm fine, Papa, just a sprained ankle. Colton's been taking good care of me." Her father turned to Colton, extending a weather-worn hand. "O'Malley, I can't thank you enough for looking after my daughter." Colton shook his hand firmly. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." "Not anyone would have ridden out in that storm," Jeremiah countered. "You've earned the gratitude of the Double H. Anything we can do for you or the Circle B, you just name it." An awkward silence fell as the two men regarded each other. Faith, watching them, realized suddenly how different they were. Her father, a successful rancher with land and means, and Colton, a ranch foreman with dreams still waiting to be fulfilled. Yet in the way they stood, in the quiet dignity they both possessed, they were more alike than different. "We can talk more inside," Faith suggested, breaking the silence. "You must be tired from the ride, Papa." The small cabin was crowded with the addition of 3 more men, but Colton welcomed them graciously, offering coffee and the last of his supplies. The 2 ranch hands, Tom and Lewis, chose to remain outside with the horses, leaving Faith, her father, and Colton at the small table. "The rustlers?" Faith asked as Colton poured coffee. "Dealt with," her father said grimly. "Caught 2 of them red-handed with Double H cattle. Sheriff's got them locked up in Sweetwater." "Anyone we know?" Colton asked. Jeremiah shook his head. "Drifters, looks like, getting desperate with winter coming on." He took a long drink of his coffee. "But that's handled now. The important thing is getting you home, Faith." "My ankle's much better," Faith assured him. "I can ride." "We brought a wagon," her father replied. "Easier on you, and we can take your horse too." Faith nodded, though a sudden heaviness settled in her chest at the thought of leaving. She glanced at Colton, who was staring into his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. "We'll leave at first light," Jeremiah decided. "No sense pushing the horses in the dark." He looked between Faith and Colton, a speculative gleam in his eye. "That is, if you don't mind putting us up for one more night, O'Malley." "Of course not, sir," Colton said. "It's a tight fit, but we'll manage." That night, Faith slept poorly despite her father's insistence that she keep the bed while the men made do on the floor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Colton's face as he'd helped her gather her things earlier, polite, distant, nothing like the man who had shared his thoughts and dreams with her over the past days. Had she imagined the connection between them? Or was he simply retreating now that her father was here, aware of the differences in their situations? Morning came too quickly. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Jeremiah doing most of the talking while Faith picked at her food and Colton responded with respectful but brief answers to her father's questions about conditions at the Circle B. All too soon, it was time to leave. The wagon was prepared, Thunder tethered behind it, and Faith's meager belongings loaded. "I'll help you up," her father said, moving toward her, but Faith shook her head. "Give me a moment, please," she requested. "I'd like to thank Mr. O'Malley properly." Jeremiah's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded, walking over to confer with his ranch hands by the wagon. Faith turned to Colton, who stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking almost as he had the first night a stranger. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, limping up the steps to stand before him. "No thanks needed," Colton said, his voice formal, "just doing what anyone would." "We both know that's not true." Faith stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Colton, these past days have been a pleasant interlude," he finished for her, his eyes finally meeting hers. but you're going back to your life and I to mine." "Is that what you want?" Faith challenged, hurt by his dismissal. Colton's expression softened. "What I want isn't always relevant, Faith. You're Jeremiah Hawkins' daughter. I'm a foreman with nothing to my name but a horse and a reputation for hard work." "I didn't take you for a coward, Colton O'Malley," Faith said quietly, his eyes flashed. "It's not cowardice to see things as they are. No." "Then what would you call giving up before even trying?" For a moment, something fierce and unguarded showed in his face, longing, perhaps, or determination. But then he glanced past her to where her father waited, and his expression shuddered once more. "Safe travels, Miss Hawkins," he said formally, stepping back. Faith felt as though he had slapped her. Swallowing hard against the sudden ache in her throat, she nodded stiffly and turned to go. She was halfway down the steps when Colton's voice stopped her. "Faith." She turned, hope rising despite her best efforts to quell it. "The harvest dance," he said, his voice low. "Is that invitation still open?" Faith couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. "It is, Mr. O'Malley. I'll save you a dance." Something like relief flickered in his eyes. "I'll hold you to that." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise, really. But as Faith allowed her father to help her into the wagon, she carried with her the warmth of Colton's gaze and the knowledge that whatever had begun between them in that small cabin during the storm wasn't finished yet. As the wagon pulled away, Faith turned to look back one last time. Colton stood on the porch, tall and straight, watching her go. He raised his hand in farewell, and she did the same, a silent promise passing between them. Then the wagon rounded a bend in the trail and he was lost from sight. The Double H Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley nestled between rolling hills, a testament to Jeremiah Hawkins' vision and hard work. The main house, a two-story structure of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides, stood as the heart of the operation. Nearby, a barn, bunkhouse, cookhouse, and various outbuildings completed the central compound, while fenced pastures and open range extended for thousands of acres in all directions. As the wagon approached, Faith felt the familiar surge of pride and belonging that always came with returning home. Yet this time, it was tinged with something else, a restlessness she hadn't experienced before. Martha, their housekeeper and cook, rushed out to meet them, clucking over Faith's injury and scolding her for gallivanting about in thunderstorms, even as she helped her into the house and settled her in the comfortable parlor with her ankle elevated on cushions. "You had us all worried sick, Miss Faith," Martha fussed, bringing her a cup of tea. "Your father was beside himself when that stallion of yours came home without you." "I'm sorry for causing such concern," Faith said sincerely. "It was foolish of me to try to outrace the storm." "Well, at least you had the good sense to take shelter," Martha said. "And lucky that Circle B foreman found you when he did." Faith smiled faintly. "Yes, lucky indeed." Once Martha had bustled off to prepare a proper meal for the invalid, Jeremiah joined Faith in the parlor, settling into his favorite armchair with a sigh of contentment. "It's good to have you home, daughter," he said, his weathered face softening with affection. "This house isn't the same without you." "It's good to be home," Faith replied, meaning it despite the strange, hollow feeling that had persisted since leaving the line shack. "Though I fear I won't be much help around the ranch until this ankle heals." "You focus on getting better," her father instructed. "The ranch will manage without you for a few days." He studied her face for a moment before adding, "That O'Malley is a good man." Faith glanced up, surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. "Yes, he is. Burke speaks highly of him. Says he's the best foreman the Circle B has ever had." Jeremiah stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. Not many men would have ridden out in a storm like that, or been so respectful while caring for a young woman alone. Faith felt her cheeks warm under her father's scrutiny. He was a perfect gentleman. Jeremiah's eyes twinkled knowingly. And might I ask what passed between you and this perfect gentleman as we were leaving? Seemed like more than simple gratitude to my old eyes. Papa, Faith protested, though without heat. She had never been able to hide much from her father's perceptive gaze. After a moment's hesitation, she admitted, "He asked if I would save him a dance at the harvest celebration next month." "Did he now?" Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, looking surprisingly pleased. "And what did you say?" "I said yes, of course," Faith replied, watching her father carefully. "Would that trouble you, trouble me?" Jeremiah repeated, eyebrows rising. "Why would it trouble me to see my daughter dancing with a hard-working, honorable man?" "Because he's a ranch foreman, not a landowner," Faith said bluntly. "I know how these things are viewed." Her father's expression grew serious. "Faith, I didn't bring you out west to shackle you with the same foolish social distinctions we left behind in Boston. What matters to me is your happiness and a man's character, not his bank account." He reached over to pat her hand. "Besides, O'Malley may be just a foreman now, but I recognize ambition when I see it. That young man won't remain a hired hand forever." Warmth bloomed in Faith's chest at her father's words. "Thank you, Papa." "Nothing to thank me for," he replied gruffly. "Now rest that ankle. I want you healed and ready to dance by harvest time." The days stretched into weeks as Faith's ankle gradually healed. At first, she was confined to the house, reading or helping Martha with mending and other seated tasks. As her mobility improved, she began taking short walks around the ranch yard, eventually progressing to light duties that didn't require long periods on her feet. Throughout this time, her thoughts often drifted to Colton. Had he returned to the Circle BTK's main ranch? Was he thinking of her as often as she thought of him? The questions circled in her mind, unanswered. Then, 3 weeks after her return home, a package arrived for her delivered by a Circle B ranch hand who happened to be passing near the Double H on other business. Inside the small parcel, Faith found a book, a well-preserved copy of Pride and Prejudice, and a simple note in a strong, clear hand for the long evenings. Until the harvest dance. C.O. Faith hugged the book to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. It wasn't a love letter or a grand declaration, but it was something perhaps more meaningful, evidence that he had listened when she spoke of missing books, and remembered even this small detail about her. That night she penned a reply. "The book is cherished, both for its contents and its thoughtful giver. My ankle mends well. I look forward to proving it on the dance floor. F.H." She sent her note the next day with a Double H hand who was heading to town. Whether it would reach Colton, she couldn't be sure, but the act of writing to him brought its own satisfaction. As the weeks passed, Faith threw herself into ranch work with renewed energy once her ankle was fully healed. The harvest season meant long days and hard work for everyone on the Double H, from gathering the last hay cutting to preparing the herd for winter. Faith worked alongside the ranch hands, earning their respect with her willingness to tackle any job, no matter how difficult or dirty. Yet even as she immersed herself in the ranch's rhythms, her anticipation for the harvest dance grew. The celebration, held annually in Sweetwater, was one of the few social events that brought together the scattered ranching community before winter's isolation set in. 2 days before the dance, Faith was helping sort calves in the corral when she heard her father call her name. She looked up, pushing back her hat, to see Jeremiah approaching with a package in his arms. "This just came for you," he said, handing it over with a knowing smile. "Seems you have an admirer with good taste." Curious, Faith opened the package to find a dress, not a grand ball gown like those she'd worn in Boston, but a pretty creation of deep blue calico with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. A small card nestled within the folds read simply, "Blue to match the Wyoming sky you love so much, C.O." "Oh," Faith breathed, touching the fabric reverently. "It's beautiful." "That O'Malley's a bold one," her father commented, though his tone was approving. "Buying a dress for a lady is no small gesture." "No," Faith agreed, wondering how Colton had managed such a purchase on a foreman's wages. "It isn't." That evening, after washing away the day's dust and grime, Faith tried on the dress. It fit as though made for her, the blue fabric complementing her auburn hair and fair skin perfectly. Standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, she felt a flush of anticipation at the thought of Colton seeing her in his gift. The night of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool, with a full moon illuminating the land. Faith sat beside her father in their wagon as they made the hour-long journey to Sweetwater, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. She wore Colton's blue dress, her hair arranged in loose curls down her back with just the front portions pinned up, a compromise between Eastern sophistication and Western practicality. "Nervous?" Jeremiah asked as the lights of Sweetwater came into view. "A little," Faith admitted. "It's been so long since I've attended a dance." "You'll remember once the music starts," her father assured her, "and I suspect O'Malley won't mind if you step on his toes a time or two." Faith laughed, some of her tension easing. "I'll try to spare him that at least." Sweetwater's town hall had been transformed for the occasion. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor cleared for dancing. Long tables along the walls groaned under the weight of food brought by families from across the county, pies and cakes, roasted meats, preserves and pickles, bread still warm from home ovens. A small band of local musicians occupied one corner, tuning their instruments of fiddle, guitar, banjo, and piano salvaged from a saloon that had gone out of business the year before. The hall was already half full when Faith and her father arrived, with more wagons pulling up outside every minute. Faith scanned the crowd anxiously as they entered, looking for Colton's tall figure among the gathering of ranchers, townsfolk, and their families. When she didn't immediately spot him, she tried to quell her disappointment. Perhaps he was delayed. Perhaps he had changed his mind. "Faith Hawkins, is that you?" A familiar voice called. Faith turned to see Mary Burke, daughter of the Circle BTK's owner, approaching with a warm smile. The two young women had become friends despite the distance between their ranches, finding in each other kindred spirits who understood the challenges of frontier life. "Mary," Faith embraced her friend. "How wonderful to see you. You look lovely." Mary, a petite blonde with a practical nature that belied her delicate appearance, waved off the compliment. "Not as lovely as you. That blue is stunning." Her eyes twinkled mischievously. "A certain foreman has been fretting over whether you'd like it for weeks." Faith's heart skipped. "Then Colton is here. He rode in with us but got waylaid by my father and some of the other ranchers talking business," Mary explained, gesturing toward a group of men gathered near the entrance. "You know how they can't even set business aside for one night of celebration." Following Mary's gesture, Faith finally spotted him. Colton stood tall among the ranchers, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing a clean white shirt and black vest that made his shoulders appear even broader than she remembered. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded hall. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Colton excused himself from the group and began making his way toward her, moving with purpose through the crowd. "I believe that's my cue to find some punch," Mary said with a knowing smile, squeezing Faith's hand before tactfully withdrawing. Then Colton was before her, his blue eyes taking in her appearance with open admiration. "Miss Hawkins," he said, his deep voice sending a shiver of pleasure down her spine. "You look beautiful." "Thank you for the dress," Faith replied, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "It was very thoughtful." "It suits you," he said simply, "blue as the Wyoming sky." "Yes, I got your note." Faith smiled. "Though I'm curious how a ranch foreman managed such an extravagance." A hint of color touched Colton's cheeks. "I may have taken on some extra work in town. The mercantile needed help unloading shipments. Small price to pay to see you looking like this tonight." Before Faith could respond, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began moving toward the center of the hall. "May I have this dance?" Colton asked, extending his hand. Faith placed her hand in his without hesitation. "I believe I promised you one. Just one." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "I was hoping for more than that." "We'll see how the first one goes, Mr. O'Malley," Faith teased as he led her onto the dance floor. "I warned you I might be rusty." But as her father had predicted, the steps came back to her easily once the music began. Colton proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent most of his days on horseback, guiding her through the lively reel with confidence and care. "Where did a ranch foreman learn to dance like this?" Faith asked as they circled each other, palms touching. "My mother," Colton replied, a flash of old sadness crossing his face. "Before she died, she insisted I learn. Said a man who could dance would never want for female company." "A wise woman," Faith said softly. When the reel ended, they moved seamlessly into a waltz, Colton's hand warm and steady at her waist. Faith was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hand in hers, his other hand at her waist, the occasional brush of his chest against hers as they moved together. "I've thought about you every day since you left," Colton said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. Faith's heart raced at his confession. "I've thought of you too." "Your father doesn't seem to mind us dancing," he observed, glancing to where Jeremiah stood conversing with the Burkes, though his eyes occasionally drifted to his daughter and her partner. "My father respects hard work and honorable intentions above all else," Faith replied. "He spoke highly of you after we returned home." Something like hope flickered in Colton's eyes. "Did he?" The waltz ended before Faith could elaborate, and they found themselves surrounded by friends and neighbors eager to greet Faith after her recovery and hear the story of her rescue during the storm. Colton stood beside her throughout, his presence solid and reassuring as she recounted their adventure with certain private moments tactfully omitted. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, conversed with friends, and enjoyed the abundant food. But Faith was most conscious of the moments in between, the way Colton's hand would find the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, how his eyes sought hers across the room, the private smiles they exchanged over shared memories. During a break in the dancing, Colton leaned close to her ear. "Would you step outside with me for a moment? There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Curious, Faith nodded, allowing him to lead her through the doors onto the town hall's small porch. The night air was cool after the warmth inside, and Faith shivered slightly. Immediately, Colton removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, pulling it close and inhaling the subtle scent of him, leather, pine, and something uniquely Colton. For a moment, he simply looked at her as though memorizing her features in the moonlight. Then he took a deep breath, seeming to gather his courage. "Faith, there's something I need to tell you," he began. "Something that might change how you see me." Alarm flickered through her. "What is it?" "I've given notice at the Circle B," he said. "Next month will be my last." "You're leaving?" Faith felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. But why? Where will you go? Colton shook his head quickly. Not leaving the area, just the Circle B. He reached for her hands, holding them in his larger ones. I'm buying land, Faith. My own ranch. It's small, just 100 acres to start, with an option for more as I can afford it. There's a cabin that needs work and the fences are in poor shape, but the water rights are solid and the grazing good. Faith stared at him, trying to absorb his words. Your own ranch, but how? When? I've been saving for years, Colton explained. Living simply, putting aside every extra penny. The bank in Sweetwater has approved a loan for the remainder based on my reputation and experience. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her wrists. I wanted to tell you that night at the line shack, but then your father arrived and it felt presumptuous. Faith repeated, confusion giving way to a dawning understanding. Colton, are you saying? I'm saying that I'm no longer just a foreman with nothing to offer but hard work, he said, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. I'm still not a wealthy man and won't be for some time. The years ahead will be hard ones, building something from nearly nothing. But I'll have land of my own, a future of my own making. He released one of her hands to reach into his vest pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the moonlight, a simple silver ring with a small blue stone. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Faith Hawkins, Colton continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. From that first night when you looked up at me in the storm and trusted me to keep you safe. I love your courage, your determination, your kindness. I love how you face this wild land not with fear but with wonder. He held up the ring between them. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. It's too soon and you deserve time to be certain. But I am asking you to consider a future with me, a partnership as you called it, equal in all things. Faith felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Oh, Colton, she whispered. You impossible man. Confusion flickered across his face. I don't understand. You speak of having nothing to offer when you've already given me everything that matters, Faith said, touching his face gently. Did you think I cared whether you owned land? That I would judge you for being a foreman rather than a rancher? I wanted to be worthy of you, Colton said simply. You already were, Faith replied. From the moment you found me in that storm and said you're found now. Because that's exactly how I felt like I'd been found, not just physically but in every way that matters. Understanding dawned in Colton's eyes, along with a hope so bright it nearly took Faith's breath away. Are you saying yes? He asked cautiously. Faith smiled through her tears. I'm saying that I love you too, Colton O'Malley, and yes, I will consider a future with you. She squeezed his hands. But I want to know more about this land you're buying. Where is it? Relief and joy transformed Colton's face. It borders the Double H on the east, he said. That old Webster place that's been sitting empty since the old man died last winter. Your father knew I was looking to buy, though he doesn't know my personal reasons for wanting land so close to his. Faith laughed softly. I suspect he might have guessed, even if you didn't say it outright. Then he doesn't object, Colton asked, still seeming uncertain of his good fortune. Object to having a hardworking, honorable neighbor who happens to love his daughter. Faith shook her head. I think he'll be quite pleased, actually. Colton's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto Faith's finger. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing of hers I kept when I left Texas. The stone reminded me of your eyes. Faith looked down at the simple band, more precious to her than any diamond could ever be. It's perfect, she said softly. Then, reaching up to touch his face once more, she asked, May I kiss you, Colton O'Malley? Instead of answering with words, Colton leaned down, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with gentle reverence that quickly deepened into something more passionate as Faith's arms wound around his neck. She melted against him, feeling as though something that had been missing had finally clicked into place. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "We should go back inside before your father comes looking for you," he murmured, though he made no move to release her from his embrace. "Or before Mary Burke spreads the news that we've run off together," Faith agreed with a soft laugh. Colton chuckled, reluctantly stepping back but keeping her hand firmly in his. "I suppose we should tell your father about our understanding." "Not tonight," Faith decided. "Tonight is for us. Tomorrow is soon enough for announcements and plans." As they returned to the dance hall, Faith felt a profound sense of rightness. The path ahead would not be easy. Building a ranch from scratch never was, but they would face it together, as equals and partners. And in the years to come, whenever she remembered how their story began, she would always hear Colton's voice in the darkness of that storm. "You're found now." It was a promise he had kept and would keep for all their days together. The following spring found Faith standing on the porch of a small but sturdy cabin, watching as Colton worked with 2 hired hands to mend the corral fence. The April sun warmed her face as she absently twisted the simple gold band that now accompanied her mother's blue stone on her left hand. They had been married for 3 months, in a ceremony held at the 88 Ranch House during a rare January thaw. It had been a small affair by Eastern standards, but to Faith, it had been perfect, surrounded by friends, with her father beaming proudly as he gave her away to the man who had won not just her heart, but Jeremiah's respect as well. The winter had been harsh, as Wyoming winters always were, but Faith and Colton had weathered it together in the refurbished cabin on what they now called the Blue Sky Ranch. They had spent the cold months planning, dreaming, and working whenever the weather permitted, repairing the cabin, reinforcing the barn, and preparing for the spring cattle purchase that would form the foundation of their herd. Jeremiah had insisted on giving them 20 head of Double H cattle as a wedding present, despite Colton's initial reluctance to accept such generosity. "Consider it Faith's dowry if your pride needs soothing," the older man had said gruffly. "Besides, those particular beeves have her favorite, marking that white star on the forehead. Seems fitting they should go with her to her new home." Now, with calving season upon them and the first shoots of green beginning to emerge across the land, Faith could hardly believe how much had changed in a single year. From that terrifying night lost in the storm to becoming a rancher's wife and partner in this new venture, it seemed both impossible and inevitable, like the changing of the seasons themselves. Colton looked up from his work, catching sight of her on the porch. Even from a distance, his smile warmed her through. He said something to the hired hands, then made his way toward her, removing his work gloves as he approached. "Admiring the view, Mrs. O'Malley?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "Indeed I am, Mr. O'Malley," Faith replied with a playful smile. "Though I was thinking the fence would look better if the posts were aligned more evenly." Colton laughed, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. "Always the perfectionist," he teased, slipping an arm around her waist. "The fence will hold, which is all that matters with calving season upon us." "Speaking of which," Faith said, leaning into his embrace, "that new heifer looks ready. I checked her this morning and I think we'll have another calf by nightfall." "Our herd grows," Colton said with satisfaction. "Slowly but surely." Faith nodded, feeling the same pride. Every new calf, every repaired fence, every acre cleared of stones represented another step toward building the dream they shared. "I received a letter from Mary Burke today," she mentioned, turning slightly in his arms to face him. She's engaged to that lawyer from Cheyenne who came to handle her father's land purchase last fall. Is she? Good for her, Colton said. He seemed a decent sort when I met him, smart enough to recognize Mary's worth at least. She asked if we would attend their wedding in June. Faith hesitated, then added, I'm not sure if I'll be feeling up to travel by then. Colton's brow furrowed in concern. Are you unwell? You seemed fine at breakfast. Faith smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. Not unwell, she said softly. Just expecting changes by summer. For a moment, Colton stared at her uncomprehendingly. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took Faith's breath away. A baby, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're having a baby. Faith nodded, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. Dr. Wilson confirmed it when I went into town yesterday, ostensibly for supplies. I'm about 8 weeks along. Our child should arrive by late October. A child, Colton repeated in wonder, dropping to his knees before her and pressing his face gently against her middle. Our child. Faith threaded her fingers through his dark hair, her heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't burst. Are you happy, husband? Colton looked up at her, and the love in his eyes was answer enough even before he spoke. Happy doesn't begin to describe it, wife. I never imagined having all this, the land, you, and now a child. He rose to his feet, gathering her close. When I found you that night in the storm, I thought I was just doing what any decent man would do. I had no idea I was finding my entire future. Faith smiled, remembering the words he had spoken to her that night, words that had become something of a private motto between them. You're found now, she whispered, echoing them back to him. We both are. Colton kissed her then. A kiss that spoke of promises kept and promises yet to be fulfilled, of a partnership that would weather whatever storms life might send their way, just as they had weathered that first literal storm together. As the sun set over the Blue Sky Ranch that evening, painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Faith stood beside her husband watching their first new calf take its wobbly first steps. The moment felt symbolic, somehow the beginning of a legacy they were building together, step by careful step. What shall we name her? Colton asked, his arm secure around Faith's shoulders as they watched the heifer tenderly nuzzle her newborn. Faith considered for a moment, then smiled. Thunder, she decided, to remind us of how our story began. Colton's laugh was warm and rich in the gathering dusk. Thunder it is. He pressed a kiss to her temple. And our child. Have you thought of names yet? It's early days, Faith reminded him. But yes, I've had a few thoughts. Care to share them? He asked, his hand drifting down to rest protectively over her stomach. Faith covered his hand with her own. If it's a boy, perhaps Jeremiah after my father, and if it's a girl. She hesitated, then continued softly, I thought perhaps Hope. Because that's what you gave me that night in the storm, even before I knew your name. Hope that I wasn't alone, that I would survive. Hope, Colton repeated, testing the name. It's perfect. He pulled her closer as the first stars began to appear overhead. Hope O'Malley. Daughter of the Blue Sky Ranch. Faith leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing through her. I love you, Colton O'Malley. And I love you, Faith O'Malley, he replied, his voice carrying the same certainty it had that night when he told her, You're found now. And she was, they both were. Found in each other, in this land they loved, in the family they were building together. The storm that had once threatened Faith's life had instead led her to the greatest blessing she could have imagined, a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky above them. As winter gave way fully to spring, then summer, and finally the golden days of early autumn, the Blue Sky Ranch flourished under Faith and Colton's careful stewardship. Their small herd grew healthier and more numerous with each passing month. The cabin, once barely habitable, had become a true home. With curtains Faith had sewn herself adorning the windows and shelves Colton had built lining the walls, gradually filling with books and small treasures. Faith's pregnancy progressed well, though not without the usual discomforts. By September, she had grown round enough that even the most generous of her dresses strained at the seams. Colton watched her with undisguised wonder as her body changed, creating space for the new life they had created together. "You're beautiful," he would tell her each morning, his hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child grew stronger by the day. "I'm as big as a barn," Faith would retort, though she secretly treasured his words. "The most beautiful barn in Wyoming territory, then," he would reply with that smile that still made her heart skip a beat. They had established a comfortable rhythm to their days. Colton handled the heavier ranch work with the help of one permanent hired hand, a quiet, capable young man named Joe who lived in the refurbished bunkhouse. Faith managed the household, the garden that supplied much of their fresh food, and the record-keeping for their growing operation. They made decisions together, discussing everything from cattle prices to fence placement over their evening meals. It was exactly the partnership Faith had dreamed of, and she treasured even the difficult days when exhaustion or disagreements tested their resolve. For every challenge they faced it together, and that made all the difference. As Faith's October due date approached, preparations intensified. Martha traveled from the Double H to stay with them, bringing with her a cradle that Jeremiah had crafted with his own hands, a gift that had brought tears to both Faith and Colton's eyes. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this," Jeremiah had said gruffly when he delivered it himself. She always hoped for grandchildren. Faith had embraced her father tightly, feeling the bond between them that had grown so much stronger in the years since she'd come west. "She would have been so proud of you, Papa," she whispered, "of the life you built here." "She would have been prouder of you," Jeremiah replied, his weathered hand gentle on her hair. "Taking to this wild land like you were born to it." Perhaps I was, Faith thought as she watched her father and husband discussing the latest improvements to the ranch. Perhaps this was always where I was meant to be. When her labor began on a crisp October morning with the first light of dawn seeping through the bedroom window, Faith felt a curious calm settle over her despite the pain. Martha was sent to fetch the midwife from Sweetwater, while Colton hovered anxiously, following Faith's instructions to heat water and prepare the bedroom. "You should wait outside," Martha told him when she returned with Mrs. Calloway, the experienced midwife who had delivered most of Sweetwater's children over the past 20 years. "This is women's business now." But Faith reached for Colton's hand. "No," she said firmly. "He stays if he wishes to." Colton's face showed both fear and determination. "I'm staying," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Calloway raised an eyebrow but nodded briskly. "Suit yourselves, but you do as I say, young man, and stay out of the way unless called for." The hours that followed tested Faith's endurance as nothing in her life ever had before. The pain came in waves, building in intensity until she could barely catch her breath between contractions. Through it all, Colton remained by her side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. "You can do this, Faith," he told her during a particularly difficult moment when she felt her strength flagging. "You're the strongest person I know." "I can't," she gasped. "It's too much." "You survived a Wyoming thunderstorm alone," Colton reminded her, his blue eyes fierce with belief in her. "You can bring our child into the world." Faith drew strength from his certainty, gripping his hand so tightly that later she would discover she had left bruises. And when the final moments came, when Mrs. Calloway instructed her to push with all her might. It was Colton's face she focused on, Colton's voice that guided her through the overwhelming pain. Then, suddenly, a new sound filled the room, the indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "A girl, Mrs." Calloway announced triumphantly, lifting the red-faced, squalling infant for her parents to see. And a fine set of lungs on her, too. Tears streamed down Faith's face as the midwife placed the tiny, squirming bundle on her chest. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Hello, Hope." Colton leaned down, his own cheeks wet with tears as he gazed at their daughter. "She's perfect," he said in wonder, "just like her mother." Hope O'Malley had entered the world just as the sun reached its zenith on October 12, 1879, almost exactly 1 year after the storm that had brought her parents together. She had a shock of dark hair like her father's and eyes that, once the newborn blue faded, would reveal themselves to be a warm hazel like her mother's. In the days that followed, as Faith recovered her strength and learned the rhythms of motherhood, Colton proved himself as dedicated a father as he was a husband and rancher. He would walk the floor with Hope when she was fussy, singing old Texas lullabies in his deep voice that seemed to soothe her like nothing else could. "She knows her daddy," Faith observed one evening as she watched them together, Colton's large hand supporting Hope's tiny head with infinite gentleness. "And I know her," Colton replied with a soft smile. "She's got your determination. See how she focuses on everything." Taking it all in, making her plans, Faith laughed. "She's 2 weeks old, Colton. I don't think she's planning anything beyond her next meal." "Don't underestimate her," he said, pressing a kiss to the baby's downy head. "She's a Hawkins and an O'Malley. She'll be running this ranch before we know it." As winter settled once more over the Wyoming landscape, the little family found themselves cocooned in the warmth of their cabin. Outside, snow blanketed the land, and the cattle huddled in the shelter of the barn, but inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and love filled every corner. On Christmas Eve, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the scent of pine from the small tree Colton had cut filling the cabin, Faith found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Colton asked, joining her by the window where she stood watching the snow fall in the lantern light. Faith smiled, leaning back against his chest as his arms encircled her from behind. "I was thinking about that night in the storm," she admitted. "How terrified I was, how certain I was that I wouldn't survive. And here you are," Colton murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Survivor, rancher, wife, mother. Here we are," Faith corrected, turning in his arms to face him, "building something I never dared to dream of back then." Colton's eyes, so blue and clear, held hers with the same steady certainty she had come to rely on. "We've only just begun," he said. "The Blue Sky Ranch will grow, our family too, God willing. This is just the first chapter, Faith." Faith reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that hard work and Wyoming weather had begun to etch around his eyes. "I look forward to every page," she said softly. "Every day with you and Hope." "Even the hard days?" Colton asked, a corner of his mouth lifting. "Especially the hard days," Faith replied, "because we face them together." From the cradle came a small sound, not yet a cry, but a precursor to one. Both parents turned automatically toward their daughter. "I'll go," Colton said, pressing a quick kiss to Faith's lips before moving to lift Hope from her bed. "Come here, little rider," he murmured, cradling her against his chest. "What's all this fuss about him?" Faith watched them, her heart so full it seemed impossible it could be contained within her body. This was her family. This was her home. And it had all begun on a dark, stormy night when she'd lost her way, only to be found by the man who would become her heart's true north. "You're found now," Colton had told her that night. And he had been right, though neither of them could have imagined then all that those words would come to mean. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the Blue Sky Ranch in a blanket of pristine white. But inside the cabin that had become a home, Faith Hawkins O'Malley knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged with the man who had found her in the darkness, and the daughter who represented everything they had built together. The storm that had once threatened to take everything from her had, in the end, given her everything that mattered. And for that, Faith would be forever grateful. As the years passed, the Blue Sky Ranch grew and prospered under Faith and Colton's careful management. By the time Hope celebrated her 5th birthday, the original 100 acres had expanded to 300, and their herd had increased tenfold. The cabin, too, had grown a second story added to accommodate their expanding family, which now included 3-year-old Jeremiah, named for his grandfather, and infant Catherine, born just that spring. Life on the frontier remained challenging. Droughts, harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices, and the occasional conflict with passing outlaws tested their resolve and resourcefulness. But through it all, Faith and Colton's partnership only strengthened, each challenge met with the combined force of their determination and love. On the 10th anniversary of the storm that had brought them together, Faith stood on the porch of their home, no longer a simple cabin, but a proper ranch house with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Colton joined her, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. 10 years, he said softly. Sometimes it seems like yesterday that I found you huddled under those rocks, half frozen and stubborn as hell. Faith laughed, leaning into his embrace. And sometimes it feels like we've always been here, like the blue sky was waiting for us all along. From inside the house came the sound of children's laughter as Hope organized some game with her siblings, already showing the leadership skills that would one day make her a formidable rancher in her own right. "You ever regret it?" Colton asked suddenly. "Staying in Wyoming? Building this life instead of returning to the comforts of the East?" Faith turned to face him, surprised by the question. At 40, Colton was still as handsome as the day she'd met him, though his dark hair now showed threads of silver at the temples, and the Wyoming sun had etched permanent lines around his eyes. But those eyes, as blue as the sky their ranch was named for, still looked at her with the same love and wonder they always had. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "This is where I belong, Colton, with you, with our children, with this land." She gestured toward the prosperous ranch spread out before them, the fruit of a decade's hard work and shared dreams. "How could I regret the greatest adventure of my life?" Colton's smile was slow and sweet, the special one he reserved just for her. "Even with all the hardships. The blizzard of '83 that nearly took our herd. The summer Lightning Creek ran dry and we had to drive the cattle 20 miles to water every other day. Even then," Faith confirmed, "because we faced it together." She reached up to touch his face, a gesture that had become habitual over their years together. "That's what makes the difference, you know, having someone to share the burdens with." Colton caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm in a way that still sent shivers down her spine even after a decade of marriage. "You're still the bravest woman I've ever known," he said. "Taking a chance on a ranch foreman with nothing but dreams and determination." "The best chance I ever took," Faith replied softly. "And you weren't just a ranch foreman even then. You were the man who found me when I was lost in every way that mattered." From inside the house, Hope's voice called out, "Mama, Papa, come see what Jeremiah can do." Faith and Colton exchanged a smile, the private communication of two people who knew each other's thoughts without words being necessary. "Duty calls," Colton said with a mock sigh, though his eyes danced with the joy their children always brought him. "Indeed it does," Faith agreed, taking his hand as they turned toward the house toward the family they had built together in this wild, beautiful land that had become their own. As they crossed the threshold, Faith glanced back once more at the vast Wyoming sky, painted in shades of gold and crimson by the setting sun. She remembered another sunset, 10 years earlier, when she had stood lost and alone in a gathering storm, uncertain if she would survive the night. "You're found now," Colton had told her when he appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to form. And he had been right, though neither of them could have imagined then all that those words would come to mean: the love, the family, the legacy they would build together on this land that had first threatened her life and then given her everything worth living for. The storm that had nearly claimed her had instead led her to her destiny. And for that, Faith Hawkins O'Malley would be forever grateful.